Not so much take up. Once we're on the wall, it's very pronounced. And then a little bit of creep before the weapon actually discharged. Really nice trigger in this weapon. Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to AmmoMart.com. First, I want to thank everybody that's been enjoying our 40 series. Like everything else in the 40 Smith & Wesson world, it's been quite interesting to read the comments and see how passionate people are both ways about that caliber. We really appreciate the interest. Today, I would like to talk to you about some trigger basics, starting with terminology and how it can help the individual shooter shoot more accurately. Today's content is more tailored towards an inexperienced shooter or perhaps a first-time gun buyer. And what I'm going to try to do is simplify some of the terms that you might have already heard or potentially will hear while you're shopping for your first gun. What I've learned over the years is there's a lot of people that have a lot more experience than others that still don't really understand the terminology behind triggers and what it actually means when you try to get off a well-aimed shot. So today what I would like to do is start with a hammer-driven single double action pistol. This is the Beretta PX4 Storm. I really like this gun. But first thing we need to keep focused on as far as trigger goes is the first term that you're going to hear is called take up. Take up in your trigger, regardless of the model, simply means when the trigger is at rest, how far will it travel to the rear before it starts to actuate the sear and the mainspring. So what I'm going to try to do is step a little bit off of frame so you guys can see what's actually going on. Now keep in mind, this gun will fire double and single action. So the first thing we're going to do is start with what happens to this trigger when we're in double action mode. So hopefully, if I stay right here, you can get a good view of what's going on a bit. So take up, as we said, is the trigger's at rest, and once I lay my finger on it, right now, that little movement is what's called the wall. Here we have take up, and when the gun or the trigger starts to pressure back, that's the wall. The wall is where the trigger and your finger pressure starts to activate the internal parts of the gun. And as you see past the wall, you'll notice that the hammer begins to move. Once that hammer begins to move, that's what's called creep. And creep is very important. Creep is where you really have to start paying attention, because the longer the creep and the more pressure it takes to get the trigger to creep could cause your accuracy to suffer. Because what we're trying to do is get the gun to fire. Once we have the perfect sight alignment and sight picture, we have to get it to fire without changing the altitude or the attitude of the muzzle. The longer and the heavier the creep, the more difficult that's going to be. So watch this. We're going to continue to creep the trigger. That's all creep, that's all creep, that's all creep. And that is what's called the break, where the gun would have fired. Now, another term you will hear related to triggers is over travel. Over travel is how much the trigger will go backwards after the gun is fired. Some guns have very little over travel, some have a lot. Triggers are a lot like shoes. Some people have preferences for how they fit, just like people have preferences for the way triggers work. Most shooters do not desire a ton of over travel. In fact, they actually install devices on the gun to eliminate over travel. I'm not a fan of that. It's unsafe, and it also leads to a lot of reliability problems with the weapon. So you'll notice in double action mode, we have a lot of creep, and a lot of creep usually relates to less accuracy. But because this is also a single action pistol, I can get to the wall. This is all take up, not creep, the wall. And now watch how little creep there is once the hammer's actually cocked. Generally translating to more accuracy for the shooter. Bear in mind, once the gun is actually fired in double action mode, the slide would travel to the rear and recock the hammer for you. So that long creep only happens the first time. Now let's pick up some other models and see the subtle differences in triggers, and we'll throw a couple of more terms in for good measure. This is a brand new handgun on the market called the BRG9 Elite. We've talked about this gun previously on the show, and I really like this weapon. What I'm going to do now is close the slide. Grip safety, of course, and I'm going to try to get this in a position where everybody can see pretty well. This trigger is straight bladed and striker fired. So once I depress the safety plunger here, you'll notice right now this is take up, and now I've hit the wall. If I keep going backwards, you'll notice there's creep. And then we fire. This trigger has a shorter creep, obviously, than the hammer-driven gun, but what's interesting about it is it's a smooth creep. It doesn't require a lot of pressure and doesn't do things called stacking, which I'll demonstrate to you guys in a second. For a striker-fired gun, straight from the factory, this has a very, very, very user-friendly trigger. Not so much take-up. Once we're on the wall, it's very pronounced, and then a little bit of creep before the weapon actually discharged. Really nice trigger in this weapon. This is our Canik Mete SFT model. I really, really like this gun. It's also a personal weapon of mine. But even though Canik is known for some pretty awfully good triggers from the factory, this one has something I would really hope to demonstrate for you guys on camera. So I'm going to close the slide. You'll notice it's kind of similar to the BRG in that safety plunger, and I'm going to use the take up until we hit the wall. Now we're on the wall. When I start to activate the trigger backwards, right now you'll notice the gun hasn't discharged, but I hit up another almost pronounced wall. That's called stacking. And stacking isn't terribly desirable amongst most shooters, and here's why. Because now I have to apply even more pressure to overcome that second wall. The weapon, however, has almost no over travel, which once again is a good thing. So let's see if we can't demonstrate that again. We have take up, wall. Now I'm going to creep, second pronounced wall or the stack, and then we fire. So one of the reasons that guns will have that stacking sort of feel to them is because there may be a burr or some unevenness to the sear. That's when certified gunsmiths will go in and polish, smooth, and sort of perfect things to take the stacking out of that. I'm all about people modifying triggers to their own personal preference, as long as either if you're going to do it yourself, you're qualified to do so, or by all means, take it to a qualified gunsmith. If you don't know what you're doing, don't. It makes the gun unsafe, potentially unreliable, and it's just not worth the risk. Now we're going to talk about another totally different trigger design. This one's from Kahr. This is called the CM9. This is also a personal weapon of mine. I love these little guns. They don't look like much, but once you get used to them, they're fabulous handguns, and you can even put one in your underwear. So I'm going to step off of camera so everyone can see the CM9. I'm going to close the slide, and you'll see that the Kahr is designed for everyday carry, and the trigger lends itself to no accidental discharges. Here's why. I'm going to pressure the trigger. That's all the take-up there is in this weapon. That little bit, perhaps more than a 1/4 inch, but not much. All of this is creep. That's a lot of creep. And it's a fairly stiff creep. But one of the things that makes this gun shootable for the length of creep that the trigger has is it's a smooth creep. There's no hitches in it. And once you learn to shoot the gun, it just pulls all the way through the firing cycle. Take up, wall. Though heavy, it's a clean, crisp break, which is another aspect of trigger design that's very important, and new shooters or potential new gun buyers for models they're not familiar with definitely need to focus on. Not all triggers operate the same way. And for instance, if you're working a gun that has a gritty sort of creep to it, going to cost you a lot in accuracy on the range until you get ultra used to that weapon. I'm not a fan of mush, which means soft, kind of unpredictable, no feedback in the weapon system, or gritty creep. I don't think some guns you'll ever overcome it, and if you take it to the gunsmith and try to get the trigger smoothed out, you're probably going to spend more for that than you did on the actual gun. One more thing we need to cover before we go is trigger reset. I'm going to grab the Canik again, step off the camera a bit. Trigger reset simply refers to how far forward does the trigger have to go before the gun is ready to fire again. One of the things that Canik Firearms does very well is they have a very short recess, and it's very tactile. You can hear it and you can feel it in your finger. The trigger almost bounces a bit, so the shooter knows when you're working the gun quickly that it's ready to refire. So here we go, wall, stacked wall, and now we fire. So what I'm going to do is advance the slide to recock the gun, and I'll try to be quiet and watch how little forward my trigger goes before the gun is ready to refire. That's it. That little bit, you heard that little click pop, I could feel it in my trigger, and the weapon was ready to fire again. So, trigger reset related to whether or not you have a quality firearm or a good trigger, once again has a lot of roots in personal preference. The shorter the reset, in theory, the potential for accidental discharges goes up, because if you're not disciplined with your trigger finger, you could reset quickly, still be applying pressure backwards, and discharge the gun. Most times for everyday carry guns, the trigger reset is a little bit longer. Now, after having said all of that, I think even with a really short reset like the Mate, it is a safe gun, and once the user gets used to it, it's actually more of an advantage than a disadvantage. I hope I've cleared up a little bit of maybe the mysteries behind trigger and trigger terms today. I've really enjoyed doing this video and hope you guys enjoy it. Don't be afraid to like and subscribe.